I never planned to become the kind of guy who gets applauded by Reddit strangers for revenge, but life has a strange way of handing you situations that force you to grow a sharp edge you never thought you had. My name is Ethan Walsh, and for most of my life I've seen myself as the textbook definition of too patient for my own good. I'm the guy who lets people merge in traffic even when they don't have the right of way, the guy who remembers birthdays no one else cares about, the guy who forgives before an apology is even offered. But that version of me began to collapse the moment my boss, a man named Daniel Reeves, decided to make me his personal punching bag for reasons I wouldn't understand until much later. For 3 years, working at Reeves and Kent Analytics felt like climbing a never-ending staircase while someone behind me kept removing the steps. I was the one who stayed late every night, fixing the messes other people created. I was the one who prepared the reports Daniel took credit for. I was the one who quietly absorbed every snide remark, every passive-aggressive email, every public humiliation disguised as constructive feedback. People assumed I let it happen because I was weak, but the truth was different. My mom used to say, "Don't start a fire unless you're ready to burn the whole forest." I always took that to mean retaliation should be reserved for things that truly matter. And for a long time, I convinced myself my job didn't qualify. But everything reached its boiling point during the fall quarterly project, a massive client analysis that could make or break our department's annual numbers. I spent 6 straight weekends building that report, running models, processing data, creating visuals, validating assumptions, all while Daniel disappeared on business trips that suspiciously aligned with his Instagram check-ins from golf resorts. I knew he'd take the credit. I expected it. What I didn't expect was for him to sabotage me while doing it. The presentation day arrived, and I walked into the conference room with the USB drive that held my finalized work. I plugged it in, opened my slides, and immediately felt the color drain from my face. Entire sections were missing. Numbers were altered. The predictive model didn't even load. It looked like the work of a sleep-deprived intern, not someone who had poured weeks of effort into perfecting every detail. Daniel put on a show, acting outraged, pretending he had no idea what happened, calling the errors unacceptable and saying he was deeply disappointed. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew with every cell in my body he had gone into the files and butchered them intentionally. The client's trust evaporated. My credibility evaporated. The CEO's expression made it clear that my future at the company evaporated too. And Daniel stood there with that false sympathetic smile, the kind that said, "I've finally gotten rid of you." He cornered me after the meeting, lowering his voice in a way that made my skin crawl. He said people like me didn't have the leadership qualities required to produce something that mattered, and that he never understood why the company kept investing in someone with limited potential. It wasn't just an insult, it was confirmation. He wanted me gone. He'd engineered my downfall piece by piece. And I walked out of the building that day with a numbness that slowly transformed into something much sharper and colder than anger. But like my mom always said, if I ever started a fire, I'd be ready to burn the forest. The next week, HR scheduled a performance review, which was essentially a polite way of telling someone to pack their desk in advance. I wasn't naive. I knew I'd lose the battle. But there's a difference between losing a battle and losing the war. And what Daniel didn't know was that I wouldn't be leaving quietly. That same evening, after everyone went home, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, replaying every moment Daniel had made me feel small, every hour of stolen credit, every lie he told behind closed doors. And then it hit me, one detail I had forgotten, something so simple yet powerful. All the work I did for the company ran through my personal software environment, including data logs, timestamps, meta records, version histories. Even the sabotaged files had hidden traces of the edits. And all those traces pointed directly to Daniel's computer. I realized I didn't need to manipulate anything. The truth, untouched and raw, was more damning than any revenge I could fabricate. It wouldn't just expose him. It would ruin everything he'd spent years building his reputation on. But I had to be careful. If I moved too fast, he'd see it coming. If I moved too obviously, he'd find a way to twist things like he always did. So I took my time. I gathered everything in screenshots, logs, metadata, backups, email trails, unauthorized access logs. I built a folder so meticulously structured it looked like something prepared for a federal investigation. And I waited. I waited for the perfect moment, the one that would hurt him the way he had spent years hurting me. Because revenge isn't about rage. Not real revenge. Real revenge is about precision. And mine was going to be clean enough for Reddit to applaud. I spent the next 2 weeks playing the part of the defeated employee while quietly preparing the very thing that would detonate Daniel's entire career. I showed up to work on time, acted apologetic in meetings, accepted every cold shoulder and hushed whisper from coworkers who assumed I was already halfway out the door. Daniel seemed satisfied, almost relaxed, like a predator who no longer needed to pretend after its prey stopped running. He didn't know that every moment he walked past me with that smug look only sharpened the blade I was building behind the scenes. The performance review HR scheduled was set for a Friday afternoon, strategically chosen because the office would be nearly empty and no one would witness the firing. I knew Daniel planned to sit in that meeting to ensure the discussion remained professional, which essentially meant he wanted to watch me crumble as they pushed the termination papers across the table. But the night before that meeting, something happened that changed the entire direction of my plan and made the revenge even cleaner than I imagined. I received an email from a former colleague named Melissa, who had left the company a year earlier. She had no reason to contact me out of the blue, which made her message even more surprising. She wrote that she had heard rumors about the quarterly project disaster and wanted me to know that she had always admired my work ethic. But at the end of the email, she added a sentence that made me sit up straight. By the way, if anything strange happened with your files, check the access logs. Daniel did the same thing to Mark before he left. Mark had been one of our senior analysts, and his departure had always seemed suspicious. He resigned abruptly after a massive project imploded, taking full blame. But something never felt right about the situation. And now Melissa was hinting that he had been sabotaged the same way I had been. Replied immediately, asking for details, but she didn't see the message until the next morning. When she finally responded, she confirmed everything: his files had been altered, his project undermined, his credibility shredded. Daniel had destroyed him just like he tried to destroy me. That revelation didn't just fuel my revenge, it gave it a new purpose. This wasn't just about my career anymore. Daniel had a pattern. A system. A trail of victims. And if I was going to expose him, I was going to expose the entire pattern. I spent the rest of the night reconstructing Mark's timeline, comparing it with the logs I had gathered for my own case. It didn't take long to spot Daniel's fingerprints in both. The access times were nearly identical down to the minute. The same unauthorized remote login. The same insertion of corrupted data. The same disappearance of original versions. Daniel had been doing this for years. And the company rewarded him with promotions for handling difficult projects. Suddenly the idea of going to HR, handing them a folder, and hoping they did the right thing felt pathetic. HR existed to protect the company. The CEO liked Daniel. The board liked the numbers he claimed credit for. Even if they fired him, they would bury the scandal to avoid reputation damage. My evidence would disappear into a locked drawer. My name would disappear with it. No, this needed to be public. This needed to be undeniable. This needed to be something the company couldn't silence or spin. And there was only one place that could accomplish that with surgical precision: Reddit's r/ProRevenge. I knew that once I posted the evidence there, without names or identifiable company details, but with enough documentation to show the truth, the story would explode. The internet hates workplace abuse. They hate manipulative bosses. They hate sabotage. And most importantly, they preserve receipts better than any corporate archive. But posting the story wasn't enough. I needed Daniel to be exposed from inside the company too. I needed the one moment where everyone, his peers, his superiors, his entire carefully constructed image, collapsed under the weight of his own actions. And then the perfect opportunity presented itself like a gift from the universe. The Monday after my scheduled termination was supposed to be the company's annual achievement meeting, the one where top performers were recognized and major projects were showcased. Daniel was slated to present his quarterly analysis, the very same one he sabotaged me for. He was going to stand in front of everyone, executives, clients, board members, and flaunt the results of work I had actually created. The irony was painful. But it also gave me an idea so perfect it almost scared me. Instead of being fired on Friday, I needed them to keep me until Monday. I needed access to the system just a little longer. So I did something unexpected. I walked into HR early that morning and calmly asked if the review could be rescheduled due to a personal emergency. The HR rep hesitated, but Daniel approved the change without questioning it. He probably thought I was delaying the inevitable. That same day, Melissa sent me something that felt like the final piece of the puzzle. She had found an old message chain between her and Mark months before he quit. In it, Mark mentioned he suspected someone had tampered with his files but couldn't prove it. He felt paranoid, alone, and worn down. Reading his words hit me harder than I expected. I realized Daniel didn't just ruin careers, he shattered people's self-confidence. That was the moment I stopped thinking of my revenge as petty payback. It became justice. Cold, clean justice. I stayed invisible the next few days. I backed up everything twice, then backed it up again 3 times. I prepared a digital package that contained chronological proof of Daniel's sabotage, formatted so clearly a child could follow it. I wrote the Reddit post and scheduled it to publish at the exact moment Daniel walked on stage for his Monday presentation. And then I did something even bolder. I created an anonymous email account and set up automated messages scheduled to send the evidence package to the CEO, the board members, the company's legal department, and my favorite, Daniel himself. Everything was set. Everything was perfectly aligned. All I had to do was show up on Monday, sit quietly in the meeting room, and watch the forest burn. Monday morning felt like walking into the eye of a storm, unnaturally calm, deceptively quiet, and humming with the kind of tension that only exists when something catastrophic is seconds away from happening. I woke up earlier than usual, not out of anxiety but out of clarity. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was finally steering my own life instead of being dragged behind it. I arrived at the office before most people, quietly slipping into my seat with the neutrality of someone who had nothing left to lose. Daniel walked in 10 minutes later, wearing a new suit and the kind of smile you only see on people who believe they've already won. He didn't even look at me. He barely acknowledged anyone. He was so inflated with self-satisfaction that if someone had poked him with a pen, he would have popped. The annual achievement meeting was scheduled to start at 10 a.m. sharp in the auditorium. The entire company would be there: executives, partners, clients on livestream, and employees from every department. Normally, they would have never given Daniel such a big stage, but he had lobbied for it hard this year. He wanted recognition. Applause. Validation. The narrative he crafted for himself was about to crumble, and he had no idea he was walking straight into the collapse. At 9:55, I slipped into a seat near the back of the auditorium. I kept my phone face down on my thigh, the scheduled Reddit post set to go live in exactly 5 minutes. My other scheduled messages, the evidence files, the copies of the logs, everything was timed to hit inboxes across the executive chain exactly 60 seconds after the Reddit post went up. I'd synced everything to the second. At 10 o'clock, the CEO stepped onto the stage, greeted everyone, and went through the usual corporate ceremony, acknowledging milestones, praising exceptional dedication, and showing slides with charts that meant nothing to anyone outside of upper management. I barely heard a word. My eyes were on Daniel. He was seated in the front row, rehearsing his facial expressions like a politician preparing for a campaign speech. At 10:11, the CEO said the words I had been waiting for. Now I'd like to introduce Daniel Reeves, who will be presenting the quarterly analysis that has driven much of our recent success. The applause was loud, enthusiastic, completely undeserved. Daniel stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked up the stairs with that self-satisfied air he wore like cologne. As he reached the podium, I turned my phone over. 10:12, the Reddit post went live. At the exact same second, somewhere in digital space, thousands of strangers were reading the opening line: "My boss has sabotaged every major project I've worked on for 3 years, but this time I caught him." My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. Instead, I felt an eerie stillness wash over me. Daniel began his presentation, clicking through the first slide, my work, my formulas. The screen behind him glowed with the visualizations I had built over those long, exhausting weekends. From where I sat, it looked like the universe itself was lighting him up just before the fall. At 10:13, the first automatic email sent. Then another. And another. A cascade of truth blasting through inboxes like a synchronized charge. Up on stage, Daniel was still talking. Our projections indicate his voice cut off. Not because of anything I did, but because something else interrupted him. Someone's phone in the front row buzzed loudly. Then another. And another. A ripple moved through the auditorium, buzzes, chimes, vibration alerts. Executives straightened in their seats. The CEO leaned toward an assistant, who suddenly looked uneasy. Daniel noticed the shift and tried to push through it. He clicked to the next slide. Instead of the graph he expected, something else filled the screen. My stomach dropped, not from fear, but from disbelief. It wasn't the company presentation anymore. It was the Reddit post. Projected. Full screen. Someone had opened it on their phone, accidentally tapped cast to screen, and the auditorium projector, always connected for convenience during hybrid meetings, picked it up immediately. The headline burned across the wall behind Daniel like a cinematic twist no one could have scripted better. My revenge was so clean, even Reddit applauded. The room froze. The CEO stood half out of his seat. People turned, whispering. Someone gasped. Daniel looked up slowly, confusion twisting into horror as he read the words. And then the next lines. And the next. And the screenshots. And the timestamps. The logs. The side-by-side comparisons. The full breakdown of every sabotage he had ever committed, formatted neatly, clearly, undeniably. His face drained of color so fast it looked like blood had abandoned him. The entire room watched him realize, in real time, that the truth was now public, and not just company-wide public, but internet public. Reddit public. Archive forever public. He stammered something about a technical issue, but no one was listening. Phones were out everywhere. People were scrolling. Comparing. Whispering. The CEO finally snapped out of his shock and demanded that the projector be shut off, but the damage was already done. The post had been live for barely 3 minutes and already had thousands of upvotes. Comments were flooding in. Screenshots were taking over company group chats before IT even knew what hit them. Daniel stepped back from the podium like it was sinking into the floor. He looked around the room with wild, darting eyes, searching for someone who might save him. No one would. His downfall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was silent. Cold. Surgical. Exactly the way I wanted it to be. He didn't know yet that the emails had been delivered. He didn't know that the legal department now had proof he had falsified performance records, manipulated internal systems, violated data handling protocols, and engaged in workplace harassment. He didn't know that the board had already replied to each other on the email thread with short, chilling messages like, "We need to discuss this immediately." The auditorium dissolved into chaos. People stood. People talked. Executives walked rapidly toward the exit. But I didn't move. I sat still, watching Daniel come apart like a poorly built structure under the weight of truth. For the first time, he looked small. Fragile. And most importantly, powerless. At 10:18, the CEO returned to the mic and announced that the presentation would be paused. Daniel was asked to step away from the stage. He obeyed, but his legs barely carried him. As he walked past the rows of employees, they didn't look at him with respect or fear or admiration. They looked at him with something far sharper, recognition. They finally saw who he really was. And he knew it. He stumbled out of the auditorium, flanked by 2 senior directors, and that was the last time I ever saw him in the building. But the day wasn't over. Not even close. Because when the meeting resumed, something happened that I never expected, something that changed everything I thought I knew about the story I was telling myself. When the meeting finally resumed, the atmosphere in the auditorium felt completely different. The air had shifted tense, electric, charged with something between disbelief and vindication. The CEO returned to the stage with a measured look that told everyone in the room the situation was far from contained. I knew my evidence had landed exactly the way I planned, but I didn't anticipate the reaction that came next. The CEO cleared his throat and said that due to unforeseen concerns regarding the integrity of recent departmental activities, the company would be conducting a full internal review. He didn't mention Daniel's name, but he didn't have to. Everyone had seen the Reddit post. Everyone had witnessed his humiliation. Everyone knew exactly who had been exposed. But then the CEO said something that made my stomach knot, not out of fear, but out of a realization that I hadn't accounted for this particular twist. He requested that all employees involved in the quarterly analysis remain in the auditorium for questioning. I wasn't sure whether to interpret that as suspicion or standard procedure. Either way, I stayed seated. A handful of executives and compliance officers entered the room, and a large section of seats near the front was roped off for the interviews. I watched as co-workers who had always avoided eye contact with me suddenly looked at me differently, curiously, cautiously, maybe even with a hint of respect they had never shown before. They didn't know yet what I had done, but they knew something monumental had shifted in the hierarchy of the office, and I was at the center of it. When my name was finally called, I walked toward the front with legs that felt both weightless and heavy at the same time. The compliance director, a woman named Caroline Tate, gestured for me to sit. She wasn't cold, but she also wasn't warm. It was the expression of someone who had just learned their company might be harboring a scandal. She asked me to explain my involvement in the quarterly project. I stuck to the facts. I told her I built the model, compiled the data, prepared the report, and had maintained backups as part of my normal workflow. I didn't mention the Reddit post. I didn't need to. It was already out in the world, living a life of its own. She asked whether I had reason to believe someone interfered with my files. I said yes, I did, and I had documented evidence. Then she asked the question that caught me off guard: why didn't you report this sooner? It wasn't accusatory, just logical. And the truth was embarrassingly simple. I told her that Daniel had always manipulated situations in ways that made it seem like any mistake I reported would reflect badly on me, not him. And worse, no one would have believed me without concrete proof. She nodded subtly, as if she had expected that answer. As the questioning continued, she occasionally exchanged looks with the two executives beside her, the kind of looks that said new revelations were confirming suspicions even they had never fully voiced. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with a kind of curiosity that made me uneasy. "It appears," she said carefully, "that you have been at the center of events that may extend deeper than we realized." I wasn't sure what that meant, and before I could ask, she dismissed me. Walking out of that roped area felt surreal. It was like I had stepped through an invisible threshold and come out transformed. Colleagues glanced at me, whispering to each other. It was the first time in years that eyes turned toward me without contempt or dismissal. But the biggest shock came not from the company, but from my phone. When I slipped it out of my pocket, I saw my notifications had exploded. The Reddit post had gone viral in under 30 minutes. Comments stacked into the thousands. Awards poured in like rainfall. The top comment read, "This is the cleanest, most satisfying workplace revenge I've ever seen. OP deserves a medal." But underneath the praise, something unexpected caught my attention. A private message. From Mark. The analyst who had disappeared after his project collapsed, the one whose story Melissa had hinted at, the one Daniel sabotaged before me. He wrote that he had seen the Reddit post trending on his feed and realized instantly it had to be the same company and the same man who had destroyed his career. He said he had left the industry entirely, convinced he wasn't good enough. Reading his words hit me harder than I expected. I had known Daniel's behavior had consequences, but seeing the damage spelled out in someone else's voice was different. It was real. Human. Painful. Mark thanked me for exposing the truth he could never prove, then said he might finally find peace knowing what happened wasn't his failure, it was sabotage. I sat there staring at the message, feeling a mix of satisfaction and something heavier. My revenge had started as personal justice, but now it felt like something bigger. something moral, something necessary. But the biggest twist came moments later when I received a new email, this time from the CEO himself. It was brief, formal, and unnervingly polite. He requested a private meeting with me in his office at 4:30 p.m. I stared at the screen, unsure whether this was about to become a victory lap or the start of another disaster. Corporate structures didn't just crumble overnight. They retaliated. They protected themselves. They found scapegoats. For a split second, I wondered if exposing Daniel so publicly might backfire on me. After all, companies hated losing control of their narrative. I walked through the rest of the day in a strange fog. Co-workers avoided me with a mixture of fear and curiosity. IT scrambled to lock down systems. HR ran damage control. Compliance officers moved through hallways like quiet storm clouds. At exactly 4:28, I stood outside the CEO's office, heart steady but alert. He opened the door before I could knock, gestured for me to come in, and closed it behind us. The office was silent. Too silent. He didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he stood near the window overlooking the city and spoke without turning around. He said he had reviewed the files sent that morning. He said the board was already discussing Daniel's immediate termination and possible legal action. He said the company owed me an apology. But then, he turned toward me with an expression I couldn't read and said there was one more thing he needed to ask. Where, he asked slowly, did you learn to build a digital record this comprehensive? The question stunned me. I expected gratitude or caution, not curiosity about my skill set. When I didn't answer immediately, he continued. He said the depth of my documentation, the precision of the timestamps, the clarity of the logs, none of it looked like something an average analyst would produce casually. It looked like something built by someone with advanced forensic training. Or someone preparing for something bigger than revenge. For the first time, I felt a chill. Not because I was afraid, but because I suddenly realized something I hadn't considered until that moment. My revenge may have been too clean. Too perfect. Too noticeable. And someone at the top had started wondering whether exposing Daniel wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something far more complicated. I met the CEO's gaze, trying to keep my voice steady. But before I could answer, he said something that changed everything yet again. He told me the company wasn't just reviewing Daniel, they were reviewing everyone. Every department. Every system. Every project. And all of it was because of the evidence I exposed. Then he asked the question that made my blood run cold, Ethan, is there anything else we should know? I didn't answer. Not because I was hiding something, but because in that moment, I finally realized the truth the CEO had just figured out. My revenge hadn't just burned the forest. It had set the entire company on fire. And everyone was just starting to smell the smoke. I didn't answer the CEO's question. Not at first. Not because I was guilty of something else, but because I suddenly realized anything I said next would decide what this entire story became for the company, and for me. He studied me with the kind of focus you only see from people who are used to reading markets, scandals, and human behavior with equal precision. I could feel him evaluating every twitch of my expression, every breath I took. Finally, I said the simplest truth, there was nothing else to know. Daniel acted alone. I only gathered evidence to protect myself. Nothing more. Nothing less. But the CEO didn't look convinced, not fully. He told me the board would continue the internal review and that I should expect follow-up questions. Then he did something unexpected, he apologized. Not some empty corporate statement crafted by legal. A real apology. He admitted the company had failed to recognize what was happening, failed to protect employees, and failed to question why so many talented analysts seemed to burn out under Daniel's supervision. Then he thanked me for bringing the truth to light, even if the method was unconventional. When the meeting ended, I walked out feeling strangely hollow. The revenge I had spent weeks crafting, the revenge that had detonated perfectly, had now grown beyond me. It wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the company. To Mark. To Melissa. To everyone who had ever been brushed aside or crushed for daring to do good work under someone threatened by competence. Reddit had its story. The internet had its entertainment. But real people had been saved from something worse. As I left the building that day, co-workers looked at me differently. Not with fear, not with suspicion, almost with relief, like I had cracked open a door they didn't even realize had been locked from the inside. I didn't sleep much that night. My phone kept buzzing with updates, the post trending on Reddit, YouTube channels reading it aloud, people dissecting the evidence, calling the revenge surgical, satisfying, legendary. But what hit hardest wasn't the praise. It was a message from Melissa, sent at 1:37 a.m. She told me she had reconnected with Mark after seeing the post, and they had spent hours talking about how much the sabotage had broken him back then. She said Mark cried when she told him the truth was finally out. I lay there in the dark, absorbing that. It was then I realized my revenge did more than expose a villain. It restored someone's sense of self-worth. It gave someone closure. It healed wounds I didn't even know existed when this all started. The next morning, I arrived at work to an email instructing me to come to HR. For a moment I wondered if they might try to fire me after all, using some policy technicality to make me the problem instead of the solution. But when I walked in, I found Caroline, the compliance director, waiting for me with a neutral but not unfriendly expression. She gestured for me to sit, then told me the board had made several decisions overnight. Daniel had been officially terminated. His access was permanently revoked. The company was preparing legal action for data manipulation, falsification of records, and breach of trust. And then she added something that genuinely stunned me. The board had reviewed my work history, my projects, my performance metrics, and determined I had been unfairly obstructed for years. They were offering me a promotion. A real one. Not symbolic. Not consolatory. They wanted me to take over the analytics division Daniel had led. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was something close to panic. I didn't want Daniel's office. I didn't want the power he abused. I didn't even want the title. But Caroline explained something I hadn't thought about: if I didn't take the position, someone else would. Someone who might bury the truth. So I accepted. Not for me. For the employees who deserved better. For the projects that deserved honesty. For the analysts who needed someone who understood what they had endured. When I walked into my new office, Daniel's old office, the irony wasn't lost on me. His nameplate had already been removed. The walls were bare. The desk was empty. It didn't feel like a prize. It felt like responsibility. I sat there for several minutes, letting the silence settle. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt peace. Not triumph. Not smugness. Peace. The following week, the company announced sweeping changes, new transparency protocols, new data handling procedures, mandatory ethics training, anonymous reporting channels. They didn't mention my Reddit post, but everyone knew it started there. Or rather, ended there. Because the real story didn't begin with revenge. It began with a pattern of abuse finally coming to light. But the internet didn't care about the nuances. The post hit the front page for 2 days straight. People called it satisfying. Flawless. Cinematic. Some even joked that Daniel probably saw it trending while updating his resume. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't any of that. It was a private message from Mark, sent 2 weeks after everything settled. He wrote, "I got a job offer today. A good one. The first in years. I don't know how to thank you." I read the message twice, then a third time. That, more than anything else, made every late night, every panic attack, every moment of doubt worth it. I didn't just expose a villain. I helped rebuild someone who deserved better. And that, to me, was the cleanest revenge of all. Looking back, I still don't know whether the CEO truly believed I had nothing else hidden. Maybe he still wonders. Maybe he always will. But the truth is simple: I wasn't the villain. I wasn't even the hero. I was just someone who refused to let injustice go unanswered. Someone who documented everything. Someone who acted when no one else would. And if that made my revenge clean enough for Reddit to applaud, then maybe it was never really revenge at all. Maybe it was justice. Finally served.